There's a moment right before a man loses everything when the world goes completely quiet. The snow stops. The wind dies. Even the engines outside stop growling. And in that silence, Ridge Callahan looked down at a column of numbers on a cheap government-issue laptop screen and understood with absolute cold certainty that someone in that building had stolen $40 million from people who could not afford to lose it. Pension funds, retirement accounts, working families who spent 30 years trusting a system that was quietly bleeding them dry. He should have closed the laptop. He should have driven away. Instead, he pulled out his notebook and wrote down the first number. That was the moment everything changed. And tonight, we're going to follow him into the dark. Hey, if you're just finding this channel, welcome. If you've been here before, you already know how this goes. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see where in the world you're sitting right now. And don't you dare leave before the end, because what Ridge Callahan did next, nobody saw coming. The diner sat at the edge of nowhere, exactly the kind of place that didn't appear on GPS and didn't want to. Black Hollow, Montana. Population something under 3,000, depending on who'd left that week and who'd given up trying. The sign above the door, Ruth's Open Kitchen, had lost the O in open sometime around the previous winter and nobody had bothered replacing it. Now it just read Ruth's Pen Kitchen, which felt accurate. This was the kind of place that kept you in. Ridge Callahan had found it 6 weeks ago by accident, which was the only honest way to find anything worth keeping. His Harley had thrown a belt tensioner 40 miles south of town, and a tow truck driver named Carl had hauled him to Black Hollow and pointed him toward Ruth's because it was the only place in town still serving at midnight. He'd eaten scrambled eggs at the counter, asked Ruth herself if she knew anyone renting, and she'd looked at him the way women with tired eyes always looked at men like him. Measuring, suspicious, ultimately pragmatic, and said she had a back room if he wasn't the kind of man who made problems. He'd told her he was exactly that kind of man. She'd rented him the room anyway. That was 42 days ago. Now it was January. The snow outside had been falling for 6 hours without stopping, and the highway beyond the parking lot had gone white and silent as a held breath. 3 Harleys sat angled in the gravel lot, their chrome catching the last pulse of the neon open sign, red, then dark, then red again, like something alive trying to decide whether to stay that way. Ridge sat in the corner booth farthest from the door, which was where he always sat, because from there he could see everything and nobody could get behind him. Old habit, the kind that never fully switches off once it's been trained into you. He had a mug of black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, a cigarette burning down in the ashtray without being smoked, and a notebook open in front of him filled with numbers that were starting to feel like a sentence being handed down by a judge he couldn't see. The notebook was cheap, dollar store. The kind with the black and white marbled cover that you buy 6 at a time because you go through them fast. He'd filled 2 already since starting the contract job. Tonight he was 40 pages into the 3rd. He stared at the column on the left side of page 38 and tapped the end of his pen against the margin until the tapping itself became a kind of white noise. The job at Hargrove Consolidated Logistics had come through a temp agency 2 months back. Ridge had done plenty of temp work over the past 3 years. Warehouse inventory, hospital records management, a 6-week stint doing data entry for a county assessor's office in Wyoming. And this one had looked like all the others. Records clerk, night shift, no direct reports, no client contact, no anything that would put him in front of people who might ask too many questions. Just a basement office full of digitized shipment manifests, payment authorizations, and vendor contracts going back 8 years, all needing to be cross-referenced and migrated into the company's new software system. Invisible work done by an invisible man. That was what Ridge did. He was good at it. He poured himself into the coffee mug, breathed the steam, and thought about the number at the top of page 38. It was a payment amount, $44,700. An invoice paid to a vendor called Meridian Supply Partners for, and this was where it had started, logistics facilitation services, which could mean almost anything, which was probably the point, except he'd seen that number before. Not once, not twice, 17 times in the past 8 years. Always the same amount, always the same vendor, always the same vague service description, always paid out of a different budget line from a different departmental account, routing through a different internal cost center before landing in the same place. Same. Exact amount. Ridge had been a combat medic for 8 years. 2 tours, Iraq and Afghanistan. Before he learned anything else about war, he learned this. Anomalies kill you. Patterns that don't fit the landscape, smells that don't match the terrain, sounds that repeat when they shouldn't. You train yourself to notice them not because you're paranoid, but because the alternative is a body bag. Most people who work in offices never develop that instinct. They see a repeating number and they assume it's a contract rate, a standing fee, something that got locked in and never updated. They file it and move on. Ridge could not move on. He turned back 3 pages and found the first flag he'd written in red ink, circled twice. Meridian Supply Partners. No physical address in the vendor system. Just a P.O. box in Delaware. A Delaware LLC, which meant essentially nothing except that someone had paid $300 to set it up. Incorporated 2016. No web presence. No employee records. No licensing documentation for any of the services they supposedly provided. Ghost. He turned forward again to a different section, October of the previous year. Another vendor, Cascade Transit Advisors. Same structure. Delaware, LLC, P.O. Box, vague service description. Payments ranging between $31,000 and $89,000. 17 separate payments over 4 years, always from a different budget line, always routed through a different internal account before arriving in the same outbound wire transfer window. His pen moved without him entirely telling it to. He drew a line, connected the 2 vendor entries, turned to a fresh page and started writing down just the routing patterns. Which budget lines, which approving managers, which quarter-end periods the payments clustered in. His handwriting got smaller as he went, tighter, the way it always did when his mind was moving faster than his hand could keep up. By midnight, he had a 3rd vendor, 4th by 12:30. Each one invisible, each one repeating, each one draining money from a slightly different part of the company's accounts. Pension fund administration, worker benefit pools, equipment maintenance reserves, as if designed specifically to stay beneath any single department's audit threshold. The cold from the window pressed against his left shoulder, and he didn't notice it. The cigarette in the ashtray had died entirely. He didn't notice that either. What he noticed was that the total amount, if you added up every payment to every ghost vendor over every year he'd cross-referenced, came out to just under $40 million. He sat with that number for a long time. Behind him, someone laughed at the counter. One of the bikers who'd come in out of the cold, big man in a patched leather vest over a thermal shirt, gray beard, and road-worn face. Ruth refilled his coffee without being asked. The kind of easy familiarity that meant he was a regular. The kind of man who'd been coming here long enough that the place had adjusted itself around him. Ridge looked down at $40 million written in the margin of a cheap notebook. He closed it. He opened it again. He put his pen down, picked up the cold coffee, drank it anyway, and stared at the window where his reflection looked back at him. 41 years old, 3 days of dark stubble, eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by most things, a face that spent too much time alone and had started to show it. The woman from the booth across the aisle had been watching him for the last 20 minutes. He hadn't acknowledged it yet, but he'd clocked her the moment she sat down. Late 30s, business clothes that didn't belong in Black Hollow, a tablet computer propped against the sugar dispenser, intermittently glancing at him over the top of it with a look that was trying very hard to be casual and failing. Ridge finally looked directly at her. She looked back at her tablet. He turned to the window instead, watching the snow. The first rule he'd made for himself after the army, after the accident, after everything, was this: don't make it your problem unless it lands directly in front of you. He'd broken that rule approximately every 2 or 3 months since making it, but it still functioned as a first line of defense, a speed bump between observation and involvement. $40 million felt like more than a speed bump. He paid for the cold coffee and walked back through the snow to the room Ruth rented him. Lucy was asleep on the fold-out couch, one arm thrown over a stuffed dog that was missing an eye, a heavy quilt pulled up to her chin. 7 years old. Dark hair fanned out across the pillow. The small television in the corner was still on, sound muted, casting blue light across her face, while some late-night weather segment showed winter storm coverage across 6 states. Ridge stood in the doorway for a moment. He'd been a father for 7 years, and it still caught him sometimes. The fact of her, the specific gravity of it. Elena had been 6 months pregnant when the driver ran the red light. She'd survived long enough to deliver, long enough to hold Lucy once, long enough for Ridge to understand that the universe was not primarily organized around fairness or mercy. Then she'd been gone. And Ridge had been standing in a hospital corridor with a newborn daughter, and a grief he had no framework for, and a war-trained nervous system that did not come with an off switch. He'd learned fatherhood the way he'd learned everything else. Necessity first. Improvise under pressure. Don't let them see you running on empty. He turned the television off gently, tucked the quilt tighter around Lucy's shoulders, and sat at the small table by the window with his notebook open and his laptop beside it. He worked until 4 a.m. By the time he was done, he had 6 vendors, $41,300,000. 8 years of carefully constructed theft, routed through the financial architecture of a company that employed 900 people who had no idea their benefits and pensions and workers' compensation reserves were being quietly bled by someone who understood exactly how the system worked because they had helped design it. Someone with authority. Someone who could approve payments above the normal threshold. Someone who could reroute budget lines without triggering flags. Someone at the top. Ridge sat back in his chair. Outside, the snow had softened to something quieter. The engines of the bikers' motorcycles were long gone. They'd ridden out around midnight, their Harleys growling briefly and then swallowed by the storm. Now there was just the wind, and the sound of Lucy breathing and the number on the screen. He thought about the temp agency contract he'd signed. Non-disclosure clause, Section 4. Standard boilerplate for administrative access to financial records. He thought about what happened to people who violated it. He thought about what happened to people who didn't. Then he thought about the name in the pension fund header. Not the company name, the beneficiary list, the 900 employees, their dates of enrollment, the date the deductions had started. He thought about a 63-year-old woman named Frances Aldrich, who had been contributing to her retirement account for 21 years and whose balance, according to the records he'd spent the last 3 hours with, was roughly 30% of what it should have been. He didn't know Frances Aldrich. He'd never met her. He closed the laptop. He opened it again and looked at her account record for a long time. He didn't sleep. The next morning arrived gray and grudging, the sky the color of old concrete, the temperature somewhere below what the body was designed to enjoy. Ridge walked Lucy to school, which was 4 blocks through snow that came up to her shins and required him to carry her the last block and a half, her arms around his neck, her breath making small clouds beside his ear. "Dad, why do your boots always sound so loud?" "They're work boots." "Everybody at school has quiet shoes. Then I'll sound interesting." She considered this for half a block. "Mrs. Farley has loud shoes," she offered eventually, as if this resolved something. He set her down at the school entrance, crouched to zip her coat tighter, tugged her knit cap down over her ears. She tolerated this with the practiced patience of a child who has learned that adults need these small rituals. "Stay in after school," he said. "Don't wait outside." "You say that every day." "And every day it's true." She rolled her eyes with the particular 7-year-old specificity that made him understand he had roughly 3 more years before she started doing it in earnest. Then she was through the doors, and he stood in the cold watching them swing shut, and stayed there an extra moment like he always did, as if he needed visual confirmation that she was safely inside before he could turn away. He turned away. He walked back towards Ruth's, took a longer route past the Hargrove satellite office on Callaway Street. It was just a regional admin hub. The real headquarters was in Billings, an hour and 20 minutes south on the interstate. But this was where his night shift assignment was based, in the annex building behind the main structure. 2nd floor. 3 other clerks on rotation. Nobody interacted much. Night shift created its own social ecosystem. People arrived, did their work, left without meeting each other's eyes. Ridge had appreciated that. Until now, it was starting to feel like something else. Something designed. The building looked ordinary in daylight. 3 stories, glass front lobby, a security badge scanner at the main entrance. He knew from his access logs that the system tracked every room he entered and every file he accessed. That was standard. But he had started noticing over the past week that certain records weren't where the catalog said they were. Digitized files with legitimate index numbers that resolved to empty containers. Placeholder entries, the kind of thing that might happen by accident in a migration project, or might happen because someone knew the migration was coming and moved things before the process began. He stood on the sidewalk across from the building for about 60 seconds. A man in a suit came out the main door, glanced at him without recognition, climbed into a company car. Ridge walked on. He'd been asking careful questions for 2 weeks. Nothing direct, nothing that would ring an alarm if someone was paying attention. Just the small, incidental kind of inquiries that happen in normal record-keeping work. Cross-referencing discrepancies, flagging missing index entries, the kind of thing a diligent temp worker does when they're trying to do the job properly. But he understood now that someone had noticed. It had started with small things. His access level to the vendor management module had been downgraded 3 days ago. He'd logged in to find an insufficient permissions error on a category he'd had full access to the previous night. He'd submitted a support ticket. No response. He'd mentioned it to the on-site supervisor, a thin man named Paulson who always wore the same gray cardigan and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke he tried to hide with spearmint gum. Paulson had said he'd look into it. He'd never looked into it. 2 days ago, 3 physical file boxes that had been sitting on the shelf in the archive room, boxes he'd flagged for cross-referencing, boxes he'd logged in the migration queue, were gone. No checkout record, no transfer log, just gone. Yesterday, Paulson had met him at the door of the annex building and told him, in the flat, slightly apologetic voice of a man delivering a message he'd been given, rather than one he'd composed himself, that due to project restructuring, Ridge's access to the Financial Records Division was being temporarily suspended pending review. He could continue working in the General Logistics Manifest section. Ridge had nodded. He'd said, "When does the review conclude?" Paulson had said, "That's above my level, unfortunately." Ridge had nodded again and gone to the Logistics Manifest section and done 3 hours of work that he had no interest in and which had nothing to do with what was actually happening. He did not panic. Panic was for people who hadn't been shot at. But he understood, with the specific clarity that comes from having operated in environments where misreading a situation gets people killed, that this was no longer a question of whether something wrong was happening. The question now was, who else knew, how far up it went, and whether he had already made himself a problem to be solved. Ruth's Pen Kitchen had 4 regular customers who came in most nights, and one of them was a man named Grimm. That wasn't his real name. Ridge had never asked for the real name. In his experience, the people who went by road names had usually earned them in ways that made conversation about it either unnecessary or unwelcome. Grimm was late 50s, built like a man who had spent decades doing physical work and hadn't entirely stopped, with a face that carried scar tissue along the jaw and cheekbone in the specific pattern Ridge associated with either a vehicle accident or a fight conducted at close quarters without adequate protection. Gray beard, close-cropped, eyes that were perpetually scanning without appearing to. He wore a leather vest over a dark green thermal, the vest patched in ways that spoke a language Ridge could partially read. Not any club Ridge recognized from his time, which meant either regional or deliberately obscure, which told him something too. A small chapter of Iron Hollow MC was embroidered across the top rocker. The center patch was a stylized mountain with a crack running through the base of it, which could mean almost anything but felt like it meant something specific to the people wearing it. 3 other men came in regularly with Grimm: Rode, who was maybe 35 and rarely spoke; Marker, who was younger still and had the watchful energy of someone who spent more time observing than acting; and an older man they called Sergeant, who walked with a cane and had a Vietnam-era tattoo on his right forearm, the kind done in the field rather than a shop. They came in around 10, drank coffee, sometimes ate, and left by midnight. They didn't bother anyone. They didn't cause anything. They existed in the space with the particular easy authority of people who had long ago stopped needing to prove themselves to rooms. Ridge had been occupying adjacent space to them for 6 weeks without them interacting much beyond nods of acknowledgement, which was the language he preferred. That changed on a Thursday night in the second week of January. He'd come in late, after 2 in the morning, because Lucy had had a bad dream, and it had taken an hour to settle her back down. He'd been sitting in his corner booth for 20 minutes, notebook open, the 3rd cup of coffee of the night steaming beside it, when he heard the booth across from him, usually empty at this hour, creak underweight, and looked up to find Grimm sitting across from him, Not next to him, directly across. The way you sit when you're having a conversation, not when you're just sharing space. Ridge said nothing. Grimm looked at the notebook. He didn't read it. It was turned away from him. But he looked at it the way you look at something you've been watching for a while and have already decided something about. You've been at that for 6 weeks, Grimm said. Not a question. Keeping track? Not intentionally. He paused. You were a medic. Ridge looked at him steadily. Why would you think that? Way you carry yourself, way you sit. You scan the room when you come in, but it's not predatory. It's triage. You're assessing, not hunting. He shrugged with the shoulder that bore fewer patches. I know the difference. Ridge turned his coffee mug in a slow circle. Marine? 2 tours. He didn't specify where or when, and Ridge didn't ask. A moment of silence that was not uncomfortable. They know you're looking, Grimm said. Ridge's hand stopped on the coffee mug. He looked at Grimm for a long 3 seconds. What do you know about that? Grimm's expression didn't change. Not much, but Hargrove Consolidated's had people asking around this town for a week, asking about the temp workers in the night division, asking who lives where and who talks to who. He paused. A man in a company car parked across from Ruth's for 2 hours yesterday afternoon, watching the backroom window. The backroom window. Lucy's window. Ridge's jaw set. You want to know how I know, Grimm said. Yeah. Because Sergeant's got a daughter who works dispatch for the county, and one of the Hargrove contractors tried to access Ridge Callahan's background file through the county records system. He folded both hands on the table, which is unusual, because temp agencies generally do their own vetting. Ridge sat with this for a moment. The coffee was getting cold and he didn't care. Who else knows, he said. Just us. Why are you telling me? Grimm was quiet for a beat. When he spoke again, it was with the particular flatness of a man who has decided how much truth to dispense and is measuring it out carefully. Because we've watched you walk that little girl to school every morning for 6 weeks, in weather that would make most people drive. Because you always put yourself between her and the street when you cross. Because you're not from here and you've never asked anyone for anything, which means either you've got no problems or you've got problems you won't share. He looked at the notebook again. And because only a man with a very specific kind of problem goes through a notebook that fast, Ridge said nothing. Grimm pushed back from the table. I'm not asking you to share it. I'm telling you that a man in a company car was watching that window yesterday. Whatever you found, and I'm not asking what it is, somebody else thinks it matters. He left $40 on the table for 2 coffees and walked back to the counter. Ridge stared at his notebook. The number was still there. $41,300,000. He thought about the man in the car watching the window. He thought about Lucy sleeping under her quilt. He thought about Frances Aldrich and her 21 years of retirement contributions. He closed the notebook and stared at the back of the door for a long time. He went back to work the next night. The logistics manifest section was tedious and benign and entirely disconnected from anything that mattered. He did his hours. He cataloged shipment records for Q3 of the previous year. He drank bad vending machine coffee. He said goodnight to the other night clerk, a woman named Jana, who always brought her own food in a cooler and wore noise-canceling headphones all shift, and he walked to his car in the parking lot at 3 a.m. with his breath-making ghosts in the cold air. The company car was back. Different car. Same posture. A man in the driver's seat reading something on a phone, parked 1 row back and slightly left, which gave sight lines across the whole lot while maintaining the appearance of casual presence. Ridge walked to his own car without varying his pace or direction. He got in. He started the engine. He drove the 4 blocks to Ruth's and the 12 steps to the back room and stood in the doorway looking at Lucy asleep. And the feeling inside his chest was the one he'd spent 3 years trying not to identify, because naming it would make it real. Fear. Not for himself, for her. He sat at the table with no notebook and no laptop, just the dark and the sound of her breathing and his hands flat on the table in front of him. By morning, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees and there was ice on the inside of the window. By morning, he had made a decision. He started copying files, not through his regular access, that had been partially restricted, but in the 3 weeks before the access downgrade, he had been working systematically through 8 years of records, and he had developed a deep enough familiarity with the system architecture to know where the redundant backups lived. Not the primary server, the secondary cold storage archive that the migration project had deemed low priority, old enough that no one had thought to restrict his credentials there. He went in through that door. Night by night, working in the logistics section with one screen while the second terminal, officially assigned to an absent colleague, ran quiet background processes he'd set up himself. He was not a hacker. He had no technical skills beyond what a combat medic picks up doing records management in a forward operating base. But he was meticulous, and he was patient, and he understood information systems the way he understood human bodies, not with formal training, but with the accumulated pattern recognition of someone who'd spent years reading what they had in front of him and deciding what it meant. He built a second notebook. New one. Bought from a different store in a different town on a drive Lucy thought was just a trip to get winter boots, which she did in fact need and did in fact get. He bought the notebook with cash. He kept it separate from the other one. In the new notebook, he documented every ghost vendor with sourcing evidence, every routing pattern, every approval chain, every budget line, every anomalous transfer date. He cross-referenced against public records, Delaware LLC registrations, some of which had been dissolved and refiled under slightly different names, and against the internal payment authorization logs he'd been able to access before the downgrade. The approvals on the highest value transfers all routed through the same senior executive chain. He spent 4 nights narrowing it. On the 5th night, he had a name: Graham Voss, Chief Financial Officer, Hargrove Consolidated Logistics, 17-year employee, company board member, signatory on the pension fund management agreement, and Ridge found this only after digging through a subsidiary filing that had been absorbed into the parent company 6 years earlier. Original architect of the vendor management framework that created the exact structural conditions that made the theft possible. He hadn't just stolen the money. He had built the machine that made the theft invisible. Ridge sat in the second terminal's chair for a long time after that. He thought about the hierarchy above Graham Voss. Vivian Mercer, the CEO, who had been brought in from outside 3 years ago to modernize the company, whose name did not appear anywhere in the approval chains, whose public statements about the company's ethics and employee commitment were the kind of language that either meant everything or meant nothing, depending on whether the person saying it actually knew what was happening underneath. He thought about what happened when you handed evidence to someone who might already know. He thought about what happened when you handed it to someone who didn't. He thought about the company car in the parking lot. He thought about Lucy's window. The cough started on a Monday. Lucy had it first, which was how it always went. She brought things home from school and delivered them with the cheerful, indiscriminate generosity of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to think of pathogens as personal. By Wednesday, the cough had settled in her chest, and she had a temperature that hovered at the edge of concerning without crossing it, and Ridge sat beside her on the fold-out couch at 2 a.m. with her breathing shallow and labored and his hand on her forehead trying to measure with his palm what he should have been measuring with a thermometer. He had $214 in checking. The temp agency paid on the 15th, which was 8 days away. The clinic on 4th Street charged $60 for an after-hours visit without insurance. He had no insurance. The contract didn't include it. The temp agency didn't provide it. And the state coverage he'd been enrolled in had ended when he crossed county lines for this job and started an application process that had been, in the bureaucratic tradition of these things, taking its time. He did the math standing in the kitchenette with Lucy coughing in the other room. If he paid the clinic, he paid it with the grocery money, which meant the next week became a problem. If he waited until the 15th, Lucy's cough might become something worse, which meant a hospital visit, which was a different math entirely. He waited until 6 a.m. and drove her to the clinic. The doctor, young, overwhelmed, apologetic in the way that young, overwhelmed doctors are before they learn to manage it, listened to her chest, looked in her ears, told Ridge she had bronchitis that hadn't yet tipped into pneumonia, but was leaning that direction. He gave her a prescription. He gave Ridge a look that meant he'd seen the insurance question on the intake form. "The prescription's $32, the doctor said. "With this discount card, it'll be around $18. "Okay," Ridge said. "The visit fee is $60. "I know." Silence. "There's a payment plan," the doctor said. "I'm fine," Ridge said. "I've got it." He paid. He drove to the pharmacy. He got the prescription. He drove back to Ruth's and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes doing nothing before going inside. Ruth had left coffee going in the kitchen. He poured 2 mugs, brought one to Lucy, drank the other standing at the window while she slept again. His phone buzzed. Text from the temp agency. His logistics manifest assignment had been extended for another 3 weeks, which sounded like good news until he noticed the hours. Reduced from 45 per week to 30, effective next Monday. A project scope adjustment. No further explanation. The number 30 was relevant because his rent to Ruth was calculated against the 45-hour assumption, and he had not signed anything that accounted for its reduction. He put the phone down. Outside, a single Harley rolled through the parking lot slowly, engine idling low, then turned back onto the highway. He couldn't see who was on it. It wasn't looking at him. It wasn't doing anything. It was just passing through. But it stayed in his mind after it was gone. Potat. He found the second pattern by accident. He wasn't supposed to be in the asset depreciation section, technically outside his current access, but connected to the logistics manifest division through a subsidiary folder structure that hadn't been correctly segregated during a software update 2 years earlier. He came across it while following a shipment record that referenced an equipment maintenance budget and found himself, without entirely planning it, 3 levels deeper than he should have been. The pattern here was different, not ghost vendors, real vendors, legitimate companies providing legitimate services. But the services billed were 6 to 8% over actual contracted rates, and the overcharge always landed in an account with a different routing number than the primary contract account. Small amounts on each individual invoice, invisible at the line item level, enormous in aggregate across 900 separate vendor contracts over 6 years, 11 million additional dollars. He sat back in the chair. 52 million. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't opportunistic. This was architecture. This was a man who had spent 17 years inside this company's financial structure learning exactly where the walls were thin, exactly where the seams were, exactly what no one would ever check, because everyone assumed someone else had already checked it. And it had worked. For 8 years, it had worked completely. Ridge's hand was steady when he wrote the number down. He was long past the point where the size of it shocked him. He was at the point where the size of it just clarified what kind of man they were dealing with, and what kind of damage he was willing to do, and how long he was willing to spend doing it. He was also at the point where he understood, with the specific certainty of a man who has been reading rooms for his entire adult life, that he could not continue operating as a records clerk who had stumbled across something. Whatever cover that fiction had provided, it was gone. Someone at Hargrove knew he had the pattern. Someone had downgraded his access, disappeared the physical files, put a car in the parking lot outside his daughter's window. The question he'd been sitting with for 2 weeks had resolved itself. It was no longer whether to act. It was only how. He thought about Vivian Mercer. He'd read her public record the same way he'd read everything else. Systematically, without preconception. 22 years in corporate leadership across 4 industries. Brought into Hargrove 18 months before the fiscal year that showed the first major anomaly Ridge had identified. Publicly committed to employee welfare, pension security, benefits transparency, either completely blind to what was happening inside her own company's financial infrastructure, or not. He did not know which. He had evidence for one scenario and no evidence for the other, and making the wrong call meant either delivering his documentation to someone who would use it or delivering it directly into the hands of the person who would destroy it. He drove back to Ruth's in the dark with the notebook on the seat beside him. Lucy was awake when he got in, sitting up on the couch with her stuffed dog, and the specific 7-year-old look of someone who has been pretending to sleep and has given up the pretense. The cough had eased. Color was coming back to her face. "You smell like cold," she said. "It's cold outside." "Why do you always go out so late?" He sat down beside her. She put her head against his arm with the complete unself-conscious trust of a child who has never had a reason to doubt that the arm will be there. "Working," he said. "You work too much." "Probably." "Mommy would say the same thing," she said, matter-of-factly, the way children sometimes say the most devastating things in the world, as if they are simply noting the weather. Ridge looked at the wall for a moment. "She probably would," he said. Lucy was asleep again in 12 minutes. Ridge sat with his arm around her and the notebook on the table across the room and the cold pressing in through the thin walls. and thought about Elena, who had been a forensic accountant, who had, for 6 years, found exactly the kind of thing Ridge had been finding every night for the past 2 months, who had told him once, lying on the couch on a rainy Sunday in Fort Lewis with a case file balanced on her knees, that financial fraud was the purest kind of cowardice, because it was violence against people who would never see it coming and would spend years not understanding why their lives were getting harder. He thought about her saying that. He thought about Francis Aldrich. He thought about the $52 million and the man who had architected it and the 900 people who didn't know. He thought about the company car in the parking lot. And somewhere beneath the calculation and the strategy and the careful, trained compartmentalization of a man who had learned to function under pressure, something older and quieter made a decision that he recognized immediately as the kind you don't come back from. He was going to move. He was going to move carefully. And he was going to move soon. And he went looking for Grim the next night. Not at Ruth's, quote, he'd already crossed too many wires between the diner and the situation to make that a clean meeting. He drove a mile down the highway to the Iron Hollow MC Clubhouse, a converted machine shop set back from the road behind a chain-link fence lined with tarp, exactly the kind of place that looked like it wanted to be left alone and communicated this through multiple layers of environmental design. He parked at the fence. He didn't get out. He sat with the engine running for 2 full minutes, which was long enough for the man on the porch. Marker, he thought, though the distance and the porch light made it hard to be sure, to register his presence. Then the gate rolled back. Ridge drove in. Grim came out through the main door before Ridge had the engine off, which meant he'd either been expected or the security system had given a long enough lead time. He stood at the bottom of the steps with his hands loose at his sides in the specific way that meant he wasn't armed, but was in a posture that wouldn't make arming awkward. Ridge got out. "I need to ask you something," he said. Grim looked at him for a moment. Cold coming off the flatland in waves. The temperature was in the single digits. Neither man was dressed for it, and neither acknowledged it. "Come inside," Grim said. The interior of the clubhouse was warm, in the way that old wood-frame buildings are warm. Not climate-controlled, but genuinely heated. A wood stove in the corner working hard. The smell of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke and machine oil, and the specific lived-in scent of a space that men had occupied for years without much sentimentality about it. A long wooden table, mismatched chairs, a wall with framed photographs, Rode at the far end of the table with a mug. Sargent by the stove, the cane hooked on the arm of his chair, watching without comment. Ridge sat across from Grim. He put the second notebook on the table. "I'm not asking you to read it," he said. "I'm telling you what's in it, because someone put a car outside my daughter's window, and I need to know if I'm about to make a move that gets her hurt." Grim looked at the notebook, not reading it, looking at it. "Tell me," he said. Ridge told him. It took 12 minutes. He spoke in the flat, compact way he'd been trained to give field reports. No unnecessary language, no performance of emotion, just events in sequence with enough context to understand causation. He told Grim about the ghost vendors, the routing patterns, the 52 million, Graham Voss's name in every approval chain, the access downgrade, the missing files, the car in the parking lot. He told Grim about Elena. He did not know why he told him that part, but it came out in the middle of the account, when he was explaining how he knew what he was looking at, and Grim listened to it without changing expression, and Ridge kept going. When he was finished, the room was quiet. The wood stove popped. "What are you going to do with it?" Grim said. "I'm going to give it to Vivian Mercer," Ridge said. "Directly, before whoever's running the car outside my window decides it's time to make the problem smaller." "You don't know if she's clean." "No." "Could be walking into the fire." "Yes." A pause. "When?" Grim said. 3 days. I need 3 more nights in the archive." Another pause. Longer. Rode, at the end of the table, looked at Grim. Grim looked at the notebook. Sargent, by the stove, had not moved. "You said she walks to school 4 blocks, Grim said. "Yeah." "On Fridays you're both there at 7:45. Ridge looked at him. "You've been paying more attention than I thought." "I told you it wasn't intentional." He paused. "But I pay attention." He picked up his coffee mug. "The next 3 mornings, someone will be doing the 4 blocks too." Ridge said nothing for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. Montana in January. The kind of cold that isn't personal, just indifferent. I don't need a favor, Ridge said. It's not a favor, Grim said. It's a decision. Ridge looked at him. There's a difference, Grim said. He didn't explain further. And Ridge, who had spent 3 years being a man who didn't accept help and had grown quietly exhausted from it, did not ask him to. He went back to the archive that night, and the night after. And on the third night, just past 2 in the morning, with the cold at its deepest and the building at its emptiest, he found one final thread he hadn't expected. A personnel file. Not financial. Administrative. The kind of record a records clerk would have no reason to be in, but which lived in a corner of the same subsidiary folder structure he'd accessed before, and which he came across in the way you come across things at 2 in the morning, when exhaustion and pattern recognition are working in combination without the interference of strategy. The file was for a woman named Sandra Keller, a former internal auditor at Hargrove Consolidated, terminated 14 months ago. The termination reason listed in the system was position elimination due to organizational restructuring. But attached to the file, in a folder that had been tagged for deletion and not yet purged, someone had missed it, or forgotten it, or simply hadn't cared, was a draft memo. Written by Sandra Keller. Dated 2 months before her termination. Addressed to Graham Voss, flagging anomalies in the pension fund administration accounts. Asking for clarification on Meridian Supply Partners. Ridge read it twice. He sat very still for a moment. Then he photographed every page. Sandra Keller had found it too. 14 months ago, she had found the same thread he'd been following for 2 months, had written a memo to the exact man who was running the scheme, and had been terminated 8 weeks later. He did not know where Sandra Keller was now. He did not know if she was safe. He did not know if position elimination was the whole story or the polished surface of one. He sat in the basement office of Hargrove Consolidated Logistics at 2:20 in the morning with the wind battering the small ground-level window and understood, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the temperature, that Sandra Keller had tried to do the right thing and had been made to disappear for it, and that if Graham Voss knew Ridge Callahan existed and was looking, and he now had no doubt that Graham Voss knew both of those things, then position elimination was a language Ridge needed to take very seriously. His phone was in his pocket. He thought about calling someone. He thought about who there was to call. He put the phone back. He copied the memo. He closed the folder. He logged out of the system, cleared his session, and walked to his car in the empty parking lot where the company car had been sitting 2 days ago and wasn't sitting now, which was either better or worse than if it had been there. He drove back through the dark. And somewhere on the highway between the Hargrove Annex and Ruth's Pen Kitchen, in the moment when the headlights were swallowed by the surrounding dark and the road ahead was only as visible as the lights would reach, he understood that Sandra Keller was the reason this had to happen fast and completely and right. Because a woman had already tried to stop this and had been taken off the board for it. And if he went the same way, there would be no one left who knew the whole shape of what was happening. And Graham Voss would continue, and the 900 names on the pension fund roster would keep losing their futures one invisible invoice at a time. And Lucy would grow up in a world where men like Graham Voss won. He drove. The dark stretched out ahead of him, and somewhere behind him, headlights appeared. A single pair, far back, steady, neither gaining nor falling away, just there, just following. He didn't stop driving. That was the first decision, made in the fraction of a second between seeing the headlights and the part of his brain that had been trained in forward operating bases, clicking into a mode that had no name but had kept him alive twice when it should not have. Don't stop. Don't vary speed. Don't signal anything. Just drive and gather information while you still have the advantage of not being certain you're being followed. He watched the mirror. The headlights stayed back. Quarter mile, maybe slightly more. Consistent interval. Not a drunk driver weaving, not a local in a hurry, not someone who happened to be going the same direction. Someone who understood distance management. Someone who had done this before or had been told by someone who had. Ridge's hands were steady on the wheel. His breathing was controlled. His mind was running the map. Ruth's was 4 minutes ahead, straight shot on the highway, turn left on Callaway, turn right on Depot. Parking lot entry from the south side, which put the building between his car and anyone coming from the highway. If he went straight to Ruth's, whoever was behind him would have his location confirmed and would have a static target. He drove past Ruth's, didn't signal, didn't slow, just continued north on the highway, as if the diner didn't exist and he wasn't tired and he wasn't carrying a notebook with $52 million worth of evidence in the pocket of his jacket. The headlights stayed with him. He drove for 3 more miles, then turned east on a county road he'd used twice before when taking Lucy out to the flat country because she liked watching the horizon. No streetlights, no structures visible from the road, just flat scrub and hardpack and the kind of dark that swallowed headlights and made the world feel like it ended 12 feet in front of you. The headlights turned east behind him. He gave it another half mile. Then he cut his own lights, swung the car right onto a gravel access track he'd clocked in memory from the daylight drives, killed the engine, and sat in complete dark and silence. The headlights appeared on the county road, slowed, stopped where his turn had been, sat for 45 seconds, then moved on. Slowly. Deliberate. The kind of slow that meant they were looking, not continuing. Ridge sat with his hand on the ignition key and did not move. 3 minutes passed. The headlights did not come back. He breathed. He waited 2 more minutes, started the car without lights, drove back the way he'd come, using the distant glow of Black Hollow as reference. He came into town from the north side, looped around behind the feed store on Birch, and came at Ruth's from the opposite direction, parking behind the building where the dumpsters blocked the car from street view. He sat in the parking lot for 5 minutes. No headlights, no company car, nothing but the wind off the flat land and the distant red flicker of Ruth's sign through the gap between the dumpsters. He went inside. He checked on Lucy. She was asleep, breathing easier than she had been, the antibiotics starting to work. He pulled the quilt up. He put the notebook under the loose floorboard beside the baseboard heater, which was where he'd been keeping the second one too. Not a sophisticated hiding place, but better than the jacket pocket. And Lucy would never look there because she had no reason to know it was loose. He undressed in the dark and lay down on the narrow cot that served as his bed and looked at the ceiling. He did not sleep. He spent the dark hours running calculations, not the financial kind, the kind that involved weight and timing and what a reasonable person could do in the situation he was in, which was a situation that had changed in character from investigative to operational sometime in the past 90 minutes, and which required him to update his understanding of what kind of problem he was actually dealing with. By the time gray light began at the window, he had 3 conclusions. First, someone inside Hargrove Consolidated had decided that the access downgrade and the file removal and the car in the parking lot were insufficient and had escalated to active monitoring of his movements. Second, he had 3 days of archive access scheduled before he'd planned to approach Vivian Mercer, and those 3 days were no longer available to him. Third, whatever he was going to do, he needed to do it in the next 24 hours, or accept that the ground would shift further underneath him in ways he could not predict or control. He got up, made coffee, stood at the window. The street was empty. Montana morning light, pale and cold. A truck passing on the highway 2 blocks over. Somewhere a dog. The ordinary texture of a small town waking up, completely indifferent to what was happening inside it. He thought about Sandra Keller.
What was he?
He found her in 40 minutes on his phone using only public sources. Sandra Keller, former internal auditor, Hargrove Consolidated Logistics. LinkedIn profile still active, last updated 14 months ago, which was when she'd been terminated and had stopped updating it the way people stop updating things when their professional identity has been knocked sideways, and they haven't yet figured out what replaces it. Previous employer before Hargrove, a mid-size accounting firm in Billings. Before that, a county auditor's office. No current employer listed. He found a public records entry, a lease agreement in Billings dated 8 months ago, which meant she'd moved, which meant she was somewhere in or near Billings, which was where Hargrove headquarters was, which meant either she hadn't been able to leave or she had reasons to stay close. He thought about what reasons those might be. He thought about a woman who had written a memo to Graham Voss about Meridian Supply Partners and been terminated 8 weeks later and then stayed in the same city as the company that had terminated her. 2 explanations. Either she didn't have the resources to relocate, or she was still watching them. He sent a text to a number he had to go to his archived contacts to find. Tommy Reyes. Former Army, 2 tours, now worked for an investigative firm in Denver that handled employment matters among other things. They'd served together for 14 months, which is long enough to build the kind of debt that doesn't expire. He sent 3 words. Need a locate. Tommy responded in 4 minutes. Send the name. Ridge sent the name. He waited. Lucy woke up at 7:15 and padded out to the kitchenette in her socks and stood against him for a moment the way she did in the mornings. Not a hug exactly, more an inventory, making sure he was still there in the same configuration he'd been in the night before. He put his arm around her. You look tired, she said, looking up at him with the frank diagnostic eye of a child who has been watching an adult for signs of problems long enough to get good at it. I'm fine. You always say that. It's usually true. She leaned her head against his ribs for another moment, and then separated and went to find her cereal, the brief physical contact closed and filed and complete. He watched her. Something in his chest that had no proper name. He walked her to school. Grimm had said someone would be doing the 4 blocks too, and Grimm was a man who said what he meant, and sure enough, Road was on the corner of Callaway and Main when they came out of Ruth's, not looking at them, cup of coffee from the gas station in his hand, watching the street with the casual surveillance posture of a man who appears to be doing nothing and is in fact doing everything. He didn't acknowledge Ridge, and Ridge didn't acknowledge him, because that was how this worked. And Lucy didn't notice because she was busy explaining something about a girl at school named Priscilla, who had apparently done something so egregious that it required narration all 4 blocks. Ridge crouched at the school entrance, zipped the coat, pulled the cap down. Stay in, he said. I know, she said. He watched the doors close. He turned. Road was gone from the corner. He'd moved without Ridge seeing him move, which meant he was better at this than he looked. Ridge filed that and walked back toward the diner, taking the longer route past the Hargrove Annex, and found the company car parked half a block up in a new position that had a better angle on the main entrance. He didn't look at it. He kept walking. His phone buzzed. Tommy. A Billings address. He drove to Billings alone, leaving Lucy at school with his phone number written on a card in her jacket pocket, and Ruth knowing the school pickup time in case he ran late. He drove the hour and 20 in a silence that was absolute. No radio, no voice notes, just the flat highway and the sky and the specific quality of winter Montana light that makes everything look like it's happening at the wrong temperature. The address was a second-floor apartment above a dry cleaner on a block of Billings that was trying to be up and coming and hadn't quite gotten there yet. Parking on the street was easy. He sat outside for 10 minutes, watching the building, watching the block, watching nothing in particular and everything at once. Then he went up. He knocked. Silence. Then the specific kind of silence that has someone in it. Ms. Keller, he said, to the door. My name is Ridge Callahan. I'm a records clerk at the Hargrove Consolidated Annex in Black Hollow. I found your memo to Graham Voss about Meridian Supply Partners in a deletion-tagged folder 2 nights ago. I don't have any interest in making your situation worse. I have a lot of documentation, and I need to know if you're okay. A long pause. The door opened on a chain. Sandra Keller was late 40s, dark circles under light eyes, hair pulled back in the way of someone who'd stopped thinking about it some time ago. She was wearing a sweatshirt and had a phone in her hand, already unlocked, which meant she'd been deciding whether to call someone before she opened the door. She looked at him. Show me your temp badge, she said. He held it up. She looked at it for a long moment, then she took the chain off. That. The apartment was organized with the specific neatness of someone who has spent a long time in a small space and has developed systems to keep it from feeling smaller. A desk against the window with a laptop and a printer and stacked files in a way that meant the desk was functional, not decorative. A 2-burner stove. A card table with 2 chairs. Books on a shelf that ran the full length of one wall, half of them accounting texts and half of them something else. Ridge noticed a row of legal procedural texts, which told him she had been learning things over the past 14 months. She gave him coffee without asking if he wanted it. He understood this as a dominance move. She was establishing that this was her space, and she was conferring the hospitality, not receiving him as a guest with a claim on anything. He sat at the card table. She remained standing. How much do you have? She said. 52 million, he said. 8 vendors that I can prove. Probably more I haven't found yet. 8 years of transfers with full approval chains, Graham Voss's name on every high-value authorization. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise. The opposite of surprise. I had 38 million, she said. I was still building. He terminated you before you could finish. He terminated me before I could do anything. She put her coffee down. You said you found my memo in a folder tagged for deletion that hadn't been purged. He missed it. She said this quietly, not with satisfaction, something older and more tired than satisfaction. He missed it, Ridge said. She looked at the window for a moment. Did you copy it? Yes. All of it? All 7 pages. She was quiet for a moment. I wrote that memo knowing he'd see it. That was a mistake. She said it without self-pity, as a factual assessment of a decision she'd made under incomplete information. I thought if I went through proper channels, documented it formally, made it a company process issue rather than a personal accusation. He shut it down before it became a process. And I was gone in 8 weeks. She sat down across from him. What are you going to do with yours? Vivian Mercer, he said. Sandra looked at him the way a doctor looks at a patient who has suggested something that needs more context. Why her specifically? Because she's the only person above Graham Voss in the company structure, and because her name doesn't appear anywhere in the approval chains. That's absence of evidence, Sandra said. Yes. That's not the same as evidence of absence. No, he said. It's not. She wrapped both hands around her mug. There's something you don't have, she said. Ridge looked at her. I found a wire transfer 3 days before I was terminated. Different from all the others. Not routed through the vendor system at all, except direct outgoing transfer from the Executive Discretionary Fund. $500,000. Different destination account. I didn't have time to trace it. Destination? Cleared through a law firm escrow in Phoenix. She paused. I don't know what it was for, but it wasn't a vendor payment, and it wasn't a payroll disbursement, and it was authorized by Graham and co-signed. She looked at him steadily. Co-signed by Vivian Mercer. The apartment was quiet. The dry cleaner below them was running machinery. A low mechanical hum through the floor. Ridge said nothing for a moment. When? He said. 14 months ago. She looked at him steadily. 3 days before my memo. He thought about this. Could be a legitimate executive fund expenditure, he said. Could be, she said. Could be a retainer for a law firm they knew they might need. Could be a payment to ensure that whatever I'd found didn't go anywhere. She paused. Could be a coincidence. Ridge looked at his coffee. I've been watching their public filings since I was terminated, she said, looking for patterns I could trace without internal access. Vivian Mercer has not taken a single public position on financial transparency or pension security in 14 months. Before that, she made a statement about it every quarter. Silence. I don't know if she's in it, Sandra said, but I know she stopped talking about the things that would make Graham Voss nervous. Ridge sat with that for a long moment. Outside, a truck went past on the street. The apartment settled back into its quiet. I need to move in 24 hours, he said. They were following me last night. Sandra looked at him sharply. Active tail, he said. I lost them, but they'll adjust. Whatever window I have is closing. Then you can't go to Mercer. Then who? He said, and the edge in his voice was genuine. Not anger at her, but at the problem, at the specific shape of a situation that kept closing off exits. Federal investigators need time to build a case. The state AG's office has a fraud division, but they move slow. Legal counsel for the employees is a 1.5 years of civil discovery. Sandra, he stopped. She was looking at him. What? He said. You said Sandra. He realized he had. Sorry. No. She shook her head slightly. It's just, nobody's used my name in a professional context in 14 months. She looked at the table. I've been doing this alone. A pause. Ridge turned his coffee mug in a slow circle. He thought about Grimm and the wood stove and the scar along the jaw and the way the man had said it's a decision as if that distinction was the only one that actually mattered. You need to leave this apartment, he said. She looked at him. If they pulled my background through county records, they might have already run yours, he said. They know you exist. They know you found it first. If they're escalating, I'm not leaving my files, she said. Bring them. I have 3 boxes. Bring them. She looked at him for a long moment, the flat, evaluative look of someone deciding whether to extend the kind of trust that has been used against them once before and left a specific shape of damage. Where? She said. Ridge thought about the machine shop behind the chain-link fence. I know a place, he said. He called Grim from the road. 2 rings. You're in Billings, Grim said, which was not a question. I need a favor. You said you don't need favors. I was wrong, Ridge said. I need space for a woman and 3 boxes of files. Safe space. Tonight. A pause. She related to the situation? She found it 14 months before I did. They terminated her for it. Another pause. Bring her. He hung up. Sandra sat in the passenger seat with the first box of files on her lap and 2 more in the back seat, and a laptop bag over her shoulder, and the look of a person who has made a decision that cannot be unmade and is still deciding how to carry it. She didn't speak for the first 40 minutes. Then she said, Who are these people? The ones with the space. Iron Hollow MC, Ridge said. He felt her go still, the specific physical stillness of a person whose assumptions have just been disrupted. Motorcycle club, she said. Yeah. You're trusting motorcycle club members with federal fraud evidence. I'm trusting them with your safety, he said. The evidence is mine to carry. She was quiet for a moment. And you trust them because a man named Grim sat down across from me in a diner in the middle of the night and told me someone was watching my daughter's window. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't want anything. He just told me because he thought I should know. Ridge looked at the road. In my experience, that's rarer than it should be. Sandra was quiet for a long time after that. Chat. The machine shop looked different at dusk than it had at night. Less like a fortress. More like a place that had simply been used long enough to become permanent. The tarp on the fence had frost along the bottom edge. 2 Harleys sat outside the main door. Marker was at the gate when they pulled up, and he opened it without waiting for identification, which meant Grim had told him. Ridge helped Sandra carry the boxes inside. The long table had been partially cleared. Rode had moved to the far end and was doing something with a carburetor and not looking at them, which was his way of communicating that he was present but not intrusive. Sargent was where he always was, beside the stove, and he watched Sandra come in with the frank assessment of an older man who has seen enough to read a situation quickly. Grim looked at the boxes. He looked at Sandra. He looked at her the way he'd looked at Ridge's notebook. Not reading it, just registering it. Coffee's hot, he said. Sandra set her box on the table and looked at Grim with the wariness of someone who had been let down by institutions enough times to be genuinely uncertain about people who didn't fit institutional categories. Thank you, she said, and the formality of it was not unfriendly. It was the formality of a person who had learned that courtesy was a form of protection. Grim poured her coffee without ceremony. She sat. Ridge stood. Grim looked at him. Tell me the new part, he said, because Grim understood that Ridge had not driven to Billings and back without finding something that changed the shape of the situation. Ridge told him about the co-signed transfer, $500,000. Graham Voss and Vivian Mercer. 3 days before Sandra's termination. The room was quiet. Rode stopped moving the carburetor. Your CEO might be in it, Grim said. Might be. So your plan of handing the evidence to your CEO is complicated, Ridge said. Grim looked at him for a moment. That's one word for it. Sandra wrapped her hands around her mug. The only pathway that doesn't go through internal channels is direct to a federal agency. SEC Fraud Division, or FBI Financial Crimes. That takes time, Ridge said. Everything takes time. We don't have time. He moved to the end of the table. They're already monitoring me. They know the direction I've been going. Another week, and they won't just be watching. They'll be doing something about it. And if they know about Sandra, they probably know, Sandra said quietly. Everyone in the room processed that for a moment. We need to force their hand, Ridge said. Make them move before they're ready, in a direction we control. Grim looked at him across the table with the particular quality of attention that Ridge had come to understand was not passivity, but the opposite. Active, total listening, the kind that comes from years of situations where the wrong response gets people killed. How? Grimm said. Give them something to chase. Ridge put both palms on the table. They think I'm alone. They think I have incomplete documentation that I'm still building. I let them believe that. I let them think I'm going to make a run at Mercer, which is exactly what they'll expect because it's exactly what Sandra did in the other direction, going up the chain. They'll prepare to intercept that. While you go a different direction, Grimm said. While I go a different direction, Ridge looked at Sandra. But I need something I don't have yet. I need the wire transfer, the co-signed one. Sandra looked at him. I don't have internal access anymore. No, but I do. He paused. For one more night. Silence. Sergeant shifted his cane. The access you have is restricted, Sandra said. The restricted access is to the Financial Records Division through the primary system, Ridge said. The subsidiary folder structure I've been using is still open. Somebody didn't complete the access audit. Either they didn't know about it or they didn't get to it yet. Or they knew about it and left it open, Grimm said. Ridge looked at him. If they're running you, Grimm said, if they want to watch where you go, they might leave a door open on purpose. The room was very quiet. Ridge had thought about this. He'd been thinking about it for the past 90 minutes on the highway with Sandra beside him. The possibility that the door he'd been using wasn't a mistake but a controlled environment, that everything he'd accessed had been monitored, that the documentation he'd built was known. If that's true, he said, then the value of what I have isn't the information. They already know I have it. The value is what I do with it. You become the evidence, Grimm said. Me and what I do next? Yes. Sandra set her coffee down. That changes everything. Not everything, Ridge said. Just the approach. She looked at him with the expression of someone updating a calculation. If they've been watching the access, then they know you have the full vendor pattern. Yes. And they know you have my memo. Yes. Then they know you know about the termination. Yes. Which means they know the story is bigger than just the fraud. She paused. They know there's a human casualty, me, which makes the whole thing harder to contain with a simple accounting adjustment. Which means the pressure to make it disappear completely is higher than it would be if I just found the numbers. She was nodding slowly. You walked into a much more dangerous situation than you understood when you started. Most of the dangerous situations I've been in looked manageable at the entry point, he said. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it that was older and less optimistic. He went back to the annex that night. Alone. Grimm had offered, not with words, but with the specific quality of attention he gave to things he was prepared to do something about. Ridge had shaken his head. Not because he didn't want the company, but because what he needed to do required him to be exactly what he'd been for the past 2 months. An unremarkable temp worker doing unremarkable records work at 2 a.m. He badged in. He went to his station. He logged into the logistics manifest section. He did 40 minutes of actual work, cataloging Q4 freight records with the mechanical patience of a man with nothing on his mind. Then he navigated to the subsidiary folder structure. It was still open. He sat with this for a moment. Then he went in. He found the executive discretionary fund section in a corner of the subsidiary tree he hadn't accessed before. The folder structure here was shallower, less file depth, fewer nested directories, which suggested it had been set up later and by someone less familiar with the system architecture than whoever had built the main financial records tree. A smaller build, more recent. He searched by date range, for 14 months back. The wire transfer was there. $512,000. Outgoing. Destination. Aldis and Crane LLP, Phoenix, Arizona. Client escrow account. Authorization, Graham Voss, CFO. Co-authorization, Vivian Mercer, CEO. He looked at it. He photographed it. He looked at it again. The description field said, Legal Retainer, Regulatory Compliance Advisory Services, which meant nothing and everything. He sat in the basement office of Hargrove Consolidated Logistics at 2:45 in the morning and thought about what it meant to retain a law firm for $500,000 3 days before terminating a woman who had found your fraud. Regulatory Compliance Advisory, the language of people who are preparing for a specific kind of fight. He copied the file. He logged out. He cleared his session. He sat for a moment in the dark of the office, and the dark was the specific kind of quiet that happens in the middle of the night in a building full of records, paper and digital accumulations of years of decisions, most of them ordinary, some of them not. And he thought about Sandra Keller sitting at the long table in the machine shop with her 3 boxes of files and her 14 months of watching from outside. He thought about 900 names on a pension fund roster. He thought about Elena, who had been a forensic accountant and who had told him once that financial fraud was the purest kind of cowardice. He got up. He walked to the door. In the corridor, the motion sensor lights activated as he moved, which was normal. They did that for everyone, all the time, every night. But tonight, for the first time, it registered to him that the lights were not the only thing that tracked movement. The security badge scanner logged every room he entered. The system logged every file he accessed. And if the door had been left open on purpose, if they'd been watching his access pattern, knowing he was building towards something, then the executive discretionary fund folder was the one they'd been waiting for him to find. He walked to the exit. He badged out. The log registered his departure, 2:58 a.m. He walked to his car. The parking lot was empty. No company car, no headlights in the street, nothing, which was somehow worse. He drove back to Ruth's with his eyes on the mirror the entire way. The town was completely dead at 3 in the morning. No headlights, no movement, just black streets under the sodium lights and snow that had been packed down and refrozen and was now the color of old bone in the orange light. He parked behind the diner. He sat in the car. Something was wrong. He couldn't name it specifically. It was the combat medic thing again. The anomaly recognition, the pattern that doesn't fit the landscape. Everything looked normal. Everything was quiet. The building was dark and still, Ruth's own apartment above the diner showing no light, Lucy's window dark. Everything looked exactly as it should. That was the problem. He got out. He went in through the back entrance, key in the lock, door swinging into the short corridor that ran behind the kitchen to the back room. He stopped. The door to the back room was open. He always left it closed. He moved fast, the 3 steps in a controlled rush, pushing the door back and clearing the frame, and Lucy was asleep, right where she should be, under the quilt, one arm over the stuffed dog, breathing easy, antibiotic doing its work, the congestion mostly gone, her face slack and peaceful in sleep. Ridge stood in the doorway for 5 full seconds. Then he checked the room, both closets, the bathroom, under the fold-out couch frame. Old habit. Irrational, probably. He did it anyway. Nothing. He sat on the edge of the cot. He breathed. He told himself the door being open was a draft. Was Lucy getting up for water? Was Ruth checking on her while he was out? Ruth had the spare key and had been quietly monitoring Lucy during his late nights, a kindness she expressed through action rather than acknowledgement. He told himself these things. He did not entirely believe them. He looked at Lucy. He looked at the window. He thought about a man in a company car watching this window, and then he saw it, small. On the window ledge, inside the room. A business card, plain white, no logo, no name, just a phone number printed in plain black font. The kind of card that costs nothing to produce and communicates through its plainness, that the person who left it wanted it to be understood as deliberate and not accidental. He picked it up. He looked at it. One side, the number. He turned it over. On the back, handwritten in blue ink, 3 words. We should talk. Ridge stood in the dark room with his daughter sleeping 3 feet away and a card in his hand from someone who had been in this room, had been standing where he was standing, while he was in the Hargrove Annex at 2:45 in the morning, photographing evidence that $500,000 had been paid to a law firm 3 days before a woman was terminated for finding the same fraud. He looked at Lucy. He looked at the card. His jaw set. His hands were still. Everything about him was still. The way a man goes still when the fear has metabolized into something cleaner and colder and more functional. They had been in this room. They had been 6 feet from his sleeping daughter, and they had left a card, which meant they wanted something other than ending this, which meant they thought they could still make him go away quietly, which meant they had no idea, not yet, what kind of man he was, what kind of calculation he was running, or the specific weight of understanding that Elena had left him with the night she died. That the people who build these systems count on silence, and the only thing that breaks them is someone who has lost enough that silence is no longer an option. He put the card in his pocket. He sat on the edge of the cot. He looked at Lucy until his heartbeat was level and his breathing was controlled, and the thing inside his chest that was not fear but was adjacent to it had settled into the cold, navigable territory of resolve. Then he picked up his phone. He called Grim. One ring. "They were in my daughter's room," he said. Silence on the line. Not surprise. Not the sharp intake of breath that the statement would draw from most people. Just silence, the kind that a man like Grim produces when he is processing information and converting it directly into action plans. "How long ago?" Grim said. "Sometime in the last 4 hours." Another silence. "Is she safe right now?" "She's asleep. She looks fine. I don't think they touched anything. I think they left a card." "A card." "Phone number. We should talk on the back." Pause. "They want to negotiate," Grim said. "Or they want me to believe they do." "What do you want to do?" Ridge looked at his daughter. He thought about 24 hours. He thought about the one door left open in the Hargrove system. He thought about the wire transfer and the law firm and Vivian Mercer's co-signature. He thought about Sandra Keller and 3 boxes of files and 14 months of watching from outside. He thought about what it meant that they had come to his daughter's room. Not threatening, not violent, a card on the window ledge, which was its own kind of threat because it said, "We can go anywhere, we can reach anything, and the only question is whether you're going to make us." "I'm going to Mercer," Ridge said. "Tomorrow morning, whatever the risk." "You said she might be in it. I know." "You could be walking into—" "I know," Ridge said, "but I'm not waiting anymore." "They came into her room, Grim. They stood next to my daughter, in the dark." The flatness in his voice was absolute. "I'm done waiting." A long pause on the line, wind against the window. "You'll need someone with you," Grim said. "No, I need someone with her." The pause again, and then, "Done." Ridge set the phone down. He put his hand gently on Lucy's head. She stirred without waking, made a small sound, settled back into her breathing. He took the business card out of his pocket. He set it on the table. He looked at the phone number on it for a long time. Then he picked up his notebook. The original one, first one, the one that started everything, and opened it to a clean page. He wrote one line, "Tomorrow." He underlined it. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a single Harley engine turned over. Low, steady, the sound of something that did not need to announce itself because it was already where it needed to be. Marker or road, one of them, cycling the block. Doing what Grimm's people did without ceremony or instruction, being present, being watchful, being the thing that stood between a sleeping child and the dark without asking for anything in return. Ridge listened to the engine. He did not sleep. He sat at the table with his notebook and the cold at the window, and the sound of Harley pipes moving slow through the empty streets of Black Hollow, and he waited for the kind of morning that changes everything. The kind you walk into knowing there is no version of what comes next that doesn't cost something. The only question was what he was willing to pay. And that question had already been answered the moment he saw that card on his daughter's window ledge. The moment they had crossed that threshold, everything else had become simple, not easy, just simple. And sometimes that was the only kind of clarity worth having. Dawn came in like something that didn't want to be there. Gray light pushed through the window of the back room at Ruth's, with the reluctant quality of a morning that understood nothing good was going to happen in it. Ridge had not slept. He had sat at the table for 4 hours with his notebook and the business card, and the cold coming through the thin walls and the sound of Lucy breathing, and intermittently the low pass of a Harley engine doing its slow circuit of the block. At 6:15 he washed his face. At 6:30 he made coffee. At 6:45 he woke Lucy with the particular gentleness of a man who is running on nothing and loves one person in the world and cannot let either of those facts show. She ate cereal. She found her backpack. She put on her coat and her knit cap, and she looked at him across the small room with the frank, undeceived eyes of a child who has been watching an adult manage a private crisis for long enough to recognize the signs without being able to name them. "Are you okay?" she said. "I'm good," he said. She looked at him for one more second. Then she picked up her backpack. He walked her to school. Marker was on the corner this morning, not road. Different build, younger, with the specific still quality of someone who had been awake for hours before Ridge had. He didn't look at them. He was looking at the street. at the buildings, at the ordinary morning moving around him, and Ridge walked Lucy the 4 blocks through air cold enough to hurt and felt. For the length of those 4 blocks, something close to functional. At the school doors, he crouched and zipped her coat and pulled her cap down. She hugged him. Actual hug. Arms around his neck. Unannounced. The kind she did maybe twice a week and always without preamble or explanation. He held on for a moment longer than he usually did. She went inside. He stood in the cold. Bum. He called the number on the card at 7:15 from a gas station payphone 2 blocks from Ruth's, which was the last payphone in Black Hollow, and possibly in the state of Montana that still worked, which was either a logistical coincidence or evidence that the universe maintained a certain dark sense of humor. It rang twice. A man answered. Not Graham Voss. Ridge had heard Voss on a company conference call recording he'd found in the archive and knew the voice, a smooth baritone that belonged to someone who had spent years making financial violence sound like rational management. This was different. Younger. More neutral. The voice of a man doing a job rather than a man with a stake. Mr. Callahan, the voice said. Who am I talking to? Ridge said. That's not important. It is to me. A pause. My name is Dalt. I handle certain situations for certain clients. What situations? Situations like yours. Another pause. You've been thorough, more thorough than expected. I'll take that as a compliment. Take it as context, Dalt said. You've built something that, in the right hands, creates a significant amount of disruption. We'd like to talk about what it would take to make sure it lands in the right hands. Ridge looked at the gas station wall. A faded poster for a brand of motor oil nobody had sold in 10 years. The specific texture of a conversation where every word meant something other than what it said. What does right hands mean to you? He said. Hands that can actually use it. The kind of process that gets real results, not a document submitted to someone's assistant that disappears into a review cycle. A brief pause. You've been trying to figure out who to trust inside the company. We can resolve that question for you. By telling me who's clean. By facilitating a pathway that bypasses the question entirely. Ridge was quiet for the moment. The cold off the flat land came through the open side of the phone enclosure and pressed against the back of his neck. And in exchange, he said, you continue your work, legitimately, with appropriate compensation and protection. Whose protection? Ours. And who are you? People who want the same outcome you want, for reasons that don't need to concern you. Ridge looked at the poster. He thought about the $500,000 paid to a law firm in Phoenix. He thought about regulatory compliance advisory services as a description of a retainer paid 3 days before a whistleblower was terminated. No, he said. A pause. Longer than the previous ones. That's a significant decision to make in 30 seconds. I've been thinking about it for 8 hours, Ridge said. The answer is no. Mr. Callahan, you came into my daughter's room, Ridge said. The flatness in his voice was total. We're done talking. He hung up. He stood at the payphone for a moment. Then he walked back toward the diner, and he was half a block from it when his phone rang. Not the payphone, his cell, Grimm's number. He answered. Get to the shop, Grimm said. Now. Something in the voice, not panic. Grimm did not do panic, but a compression of register that in another man would have been shouting. Ridge changed direction. What happened? He said. Road found something at the annex building. A pause. Just come. The machine shop felt different in morning light, smaller. The wood stove was cold for the first time Ridge had ever been there, which struck him as significant before he understood why. Grimm was at the table. Sandra was in the far chair with her laptop open, and her face had the quality of someone who has been sitting with something terrible long enough to stop looking surprised by it and start looking hollow. Marker came in behind Ridge and closed the door. Rode was not there. Where's Rode? Ridge said. Clinic, Grimm said. He's okay. What happened? Grimm looked at him, then at Sandra. Sandra looked at her laptop screen, then back at Ridge, and the expression on her face was the one he'd been building toward for 2 months. The one you get when the complete picture assembles itself and is worse than any of the individual pieces suggested. Tell him, Grimm said. Sandra turned the laptop to face Ridge. It was an article. Not a major publication. A regional business news site out of Billings, 18 months old, 300 words. A story about a corporate acquisition. Hargrove Consolidated Logistics, acquiring a logistics software company called Pathan Systems. He looked at it. He read the executive quotes. Standard acquisition language. Value creation. Operational synergy. Read the second paragraph, Sandra said. He read the second paragraph. Pathan Systems had been founded in 2014 by a consortium of investors. The founding investor group included 2 private equity firms, a venture fund, and I listed third, a holding company called Crestmark Capital Partners, which had contributed the initial capitalization in exchange for a 40% stake. He looked at Sandra. Keep reading, she said. Crestmark Capital Partners. He looked at the name. He had not encountered it anywhere in the Hargrove financial records he'd spent 2 months building. It was not a vendor. It was not an internal account. It was not in the approval chains. Who is Crestmark? He said. Look at the beneficial ownership filing, Sandra said. She reached over and clicked to a second tab, a Delaware corporate disclosure document. Crestmark Capital Partners, LLC. Principal beneficial owner. Ridge read the name. He was quiet for 4 seconds. Marcus Halden, he said. Marcus Halden, Sandra said. Ridge looked at the name. Marcus Halden was not Graham Voss. He was not a Hargrove employee. He was not in any document Ridge had spent 2 months building. He was the Deputy Secretary for Commerce and Infrastructure for the state of Montana, appointed 3 years ago, previously the chairman of the State Pension Oversight Committee. And Ridge ran this connection in the 5 seconds it took his mind to finish the map. The primary external trustee of the Hargrove Employee Pension Fund for the preceding 6 years. The man responsible for external oversight of the pension fund had a beneficial ownership stake in the company that had sold proprietary software to the company whose pension fund he was overseeing. That was a conflict of interest, but that was not what Ridge was looking at. He was looking at the routing pattern. He pulled his own notebook. He found page 41, the largest single category transfer from the pension fund administration account. $8.2 million over 4 disbursements, routed through a vendor called Cascade Transit Advisors to a clearing account Ridge had never been able to trace to a destination. Cascade Transit Advisors, he said. Registered in Delaware 14 months ago, Sandra said, after I was terminated. Registered to, I couldn't trace it from public records, she said. But Rode could. She looked at Grimm. Grimm looked at the table. Rode has a former colleague, someone who does deeper research. He spent last night running Cascade's corporate structure. Cascade Transit Advisors is a subsidiary, Ridge said. He wasn't asking. The shape had completed itself. 7th-tier subsidiary of Crestmark Capital Partners, Sandra said. Ridge sat down. The machine shop was very quiet. He thought about $52 million. And then he thought about $8 million going to a company owned by the state pension fund's external trustee, the man whose job was to ensure that the pension fund was not being robbed, and he thought about what that meant. This isn't just Graham Voss, he said. No, Sandra said. Voss built the machine inside the company, but Halden built the pipe outside it, the external pipeline that moved the money once it was out. He looked at the laptop. They've been doing this together. For at least 6 years, Sandra said, probably longer. The software acquisition gave Halden a financial relationship with Hargrove that could explain any unusual payment as a legitimate intercompany transaction. And Vivian Mercer, Ridge said, the co-signed transfer. Sandra was quiet for a moment. I don't know if she knew what she was signing. The description on the wire transfer was a legal retainer. If Graham presented it to her as standard regulatory compliance coverage for the pension fund, she might have signed it without understanding what it was paying for, Ridge said. Or she understood exactly. Silence. Halden is a government official, Ridge said. This isn't just corporate fraud. This is a government official using his regulatory position to facilitate the theft of pension funds from 900 employees. The words lay in the room. If this goes to the SEC, Sandra said, they have to refer the government component to DOJ, which means the FBI. Which means a federal investigation with jurisdiction over both the corporate and government angles. Which means Halden knows he cannot allow this documentation to reach anyone with the authority to act on it, Ridge said. Because for Graham Voss, this is fraud charges. For Marcus Halden, this is the end of everything. Grim looked at Ridge. Dalt, Ridge said, the man who called me. People who want the same outcome for reasons that don't need to concern you. He looked at Grim. He's not working for Graham Voss. No, Grim said. He's working for Halden. That's what I think, Grim said. The wood stove was cold. The machine shop was cold. The Montana morning pressed against the metal walls with indifferent patience. And Rode, Ridge said. Rode went to the annex last night. He drove by the annex at 4 this morning, Grim said. Saw the company car was back. Pulled over to get eyes on it, make sure it wasn't moving toward Ruth's. He paused. Second man came around the far corner of the building. Rode was on foot. It got physical. How physical? Cracked rib, maybe, cut above the ear. He drove himself to the clinic. Grim's voice was flat throughout this. Not dismissive, controlled. The other man drove away. Rode got a plate. Ridge looked at Grim. Registered to a private security firm out of Billings, Grim said. Halden connected. The silence in the room had weight now. They put private security on the building, Ridge said. Not Hargrove security. Not Graham Voss's people. Halden's people. Which means Halden already knows you have the full picture, Sandra said. Or he thinks I'm close enough that it doesn't matter. Rode could have been hurt worse, Marker said from near the door. He said it quietly, without heat, but it was the first time he'd spoken in the room, and the weight of it arrived accordingly. Ridge looked at him. Marker was looking at the table. Young enough that the steadiness in his face was something he'd had to build rather than something he'd been born with, and you could see the work of that construction in the set of his jaw. I know, Ridge said. This is bigger than a records clerk in a fraud case, Marker said. Yes. This is a government official running an active operation to bury evidence. That's not the same thing. No, Ridge said. It's not. Marker looked at him. And we're in it. The statement didn't have accusation in it. It had assessment. The specific quality of a man taking inventory of his situation with clear eyes. Grim looked at Marker, a long look, the kind that moved information between people who knew each other well enough to speak without words. Then Grim looked at Ridge. He's right, Grim said. I want you to understand what that means, what we walked into when we walked into this. I know, Ridge said. No, Grim said. I want to say it out loud. He put both forearms on the table. Iron Hollow has been in this town for 11 years. We built something here. We have people here, not just the ones at this table. Sargent has a daughter who works dispatch. Marker has a mother who runs the hardware store on 5th. Rode grew up 6 miles east of here. He paused. If Marcus Halden decides that containing this situation means applying pressure to people connected to us, then this isn't just my problem anymore, Ridge said. It hasn't been just your problem since the night I sat down across from you, Grim said. I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty. I'm saying it so we understand each other. We're not bystanders. We're in it. And I made that decision with open eyes, and so did the men at this table. But I need to know that you understand the weight of that. Ridge looked at him. The morning light came through the high window of the machine shop and lay across the table in a cold bar that illuminated the grain of the wood, the rings left by coffee mugs, the specific texture of a surface that had been used for years by men who worked with their hands and thought with their heads, and had learned that the two activities were not as separate as most people believed. I understand, Ridge said. Then tell me how we end this, Grim said. Not how we survive it, how we end it. Sandra found it. She found it at 9:40 in the morning, having been working at the laptop since before Ridge arrived, running Crestmark's subsidiary structure 3 levels deeper than Rhodes' contact had gone. It was a patience and pattern exercise of the kind she'd been doing for 14 months, and she found it the way you find things when you've been looking for a long time, not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet there it is that she said under her breath before she raised her voice. The pension fund management agreement, she said. Ridge and Grim both looked at her. The primary document governing how Hargrove's pension fund is managed. The one that creates the fiduciary relationship between the company and the external trustee. It's renewed every 3 years. She turned the laptop. The most recent renewal was 18 months ago. Standard language, standard terms. She paused. Except it has an amendment, attached at the back, page 47 of a 46-page document. Ridge looked at the screen. The amendment creates a provision for expedited fund disbursement under emergency conditions, Sandra said. Specifically, and I want you to hear the exact language, in circumstances where the fund administrator determines that immediate asset protection measures are required due to regulatory review or legal action, the external trustee is empowered to authorize accelerated disbursement without standard board approval. The room was quiet. They built an escape hatch, Ridge said. If a federal investigation opens, if someone files a referral that triggers an SEC or FBI review, Marcus Halden has the unilateral authority to move the pension fund assets before the investigation can freeze them. She looked at Ridge. He built this into the fund management agreement 18 months ago, a year before my memo, a year before any of this started to surface. Ridge stared at the screen. How much is left in the fund? Grimm said. Sandra looked at her notes. Based on the current balance statements I have, roughly $22 million. The rest has already been moved. $22 million, Ridge said, that he can move legally under the terms of the fund agreement the moment a federal investigation is triggered. Which means if you go to the FBI, the money disappears before they can freeze it, Ridge said. The employees get nothing, Sandra said, not even the remainder. The weight of this assembled itself in the room. He designed it, Ridge said, the whole architecture, not just the theft, the exit. If he ever got close to exposure, he built a mechanism to complete the robbery before anyone could stop him. He sat back. Graham Voss built the machine inside the company. Halden built the exit outside it, and the fund management amendment is the door. And you can't open a federal investigation without triggering the door, Grimm said. No, so you can't go to the FBI. Not directly, not without advance coordination to freeze the fund before the investigation opens officially. And to coordinate that, you need someone inside the federal system who can act before the investigation is formally logged, Sandra said. Someone who can move to freeze the assets administratively before Halden knows the investigation exists. That's not how investigations work, Ridge said. No, she said. It's not. Silence. Ridge looked at the table. He thought about the shape of the trap. $22 million sitting in a fund with a legal mechanism for its removal attached to the exact event that would normally be its protection. A system that looked like a safeguard and was actually a final theft waiting to be triggered. He thought about 900 names. He thought about Francis Aldrich and 21 years of contributions. He thought about Sandra Keller sitting across from Graham Voss's name in a memo she wrote 14 months ago in the genuine belief that proper channels worked. He thought about Elena. She would have seen this. She would have sat where Sandra was sitting and read the amendment on page 47 and understood immediately what it was and what it meant and what you had to do about it. She had been the kind of person who could hold the full weight of institutional wrongdoing without flinching and without becoming something uglier than the problem. He had not always been that person. He was trying. Vivian Mercer, Ridge said. Sandra looked at him. She co-signed a wire transfer to a law firm, he said. Maybe she knew why. Maybe she didn't. But she's been CEO for 3 years. She employs 900 people. And if Marcus Halden triggers that emergency disbursement clause, her name is going to be on the pension fund management agreement alongside his as the company's authorizing signatory. He paused. She's not just potentially complicit. She's potentially the person who goes to prison while Halden walks, because her signature is on the document and his role as external trustee is arguably advisory. The room was completely still. She's the patsy, Sandra said quietly. If she didn't know what she was signing, if Graham Voss managed her signature onto that amendment the same way he managed the co-signed wire transfer, then she's the one holding the paper when this comes down, Ridge said. And Halden walks away as an external trustee who made decisions under the authority the agreement gave him. Grimm looked at him. You think she doesn't know? I think there's a 40% chance she doesn't know, Ridge said. And a 40% chance is enough that I need to find out. And the other 20%, Grimm said. Ridge looked at him. She's in it, Grimm said. Then I'll know that too, Ridge said, when I look at her. Grimm sat with this. Then Marker's phone buzzed on the table. Everyone looked at it. Marker picked it up, read something. His face did not change, but his body did. A particular kind of stilling, the physical adjustment of someone receiving news that requires recalibration. He looked at Grimm. "What?" Grimm said. "Sergeant's daughter at dispatch," Marker said. "Patrol just got a call." He paused. "Ruth's?" Ridge was standing before he was aware of deciding to stand. "Lucy?" he said. The word came out stripped of everything except its meaning. "No," Marker said. "Ruth herself. Someone came in this morning, before opening, told her to pass a message." He put the phone down. "Message is for you. Message is, and I'm reading it directly. The documentation you've built belongs to Marcus Halden. Return it by 6 p.m., or the child doesn't walk home from school." The machine shop was absolutely silent. Ridge's hands were flat on the table. He was not shaking. He was the opposite of shaking, the specific absolute stillness of a man in whom everything peripheral has been stripped away, and what remains is operating with total, terrifying clarity. He looked at Grimm. Grimm looked back at him. Neither man spoke for a long moment. "They threatened her," Ridge said. "Yes," Grimm said. "Explicitly." "Yes." Ridge looked at his hands on the table. He thought about his notebook. He thought about Sandra's 3 boxes of files. He thought about $52 million and page 47 of a 46-page document and Rhodes' cracked rib and the business card on Lucy's window ledge. He thought about Elena saying financial fraud is the purest kind of cowardice. He thought about what cowards do when they think they've found the one thing that makes a man stop. He thought about whether they were right. And in the long, cold silence of the machine shop, something that had been a calculation became a different thing entirely. Not rage, not fear. Something beneath both of those, older, quieter, the specific temperature of a man who has already lost the most important thing he ever had, and who has spent 3 years learning to carry that weight without being destroyed by it, and who is now looking at a group of people who have put their hand on the one remaining thing he cannot lose. He straightened. He looked at Grimm. "Get Lucy out of school now," he said. "I don't care how. Get her out and get her somewhere they can't reach." "Done," Grimm said, and he was already reaching for his phone. "Sandra." Ridge turned to her. "Can you build a parallel documentation set? Everything we have, organized for external transmission. Something that can go to multiple recipients simultaneously." "How long do I have?" 4 hours. She pulled her laptop closer. "I'll need your notebooks." He took them from his jacket and set them on the table. "Marker," Ridge said. "Yeah," Marker said. "I need a vehicle they haven't seen." He paused. "I'm going to Billings." Grimm looked up from his phone. "Mercer." "Mercer," Ridge said. "Before 6, before Halden can move again. Before any of this can get any more complicated than it already is." "Ridge, Chipashti," Sandra's voice, carefully leveled. "If she's in it, then I'll know," he said, "and I'll adjust." He picked up his jacket. He looked at the table, Sam, at the notebooks, at Sandra's open laptop, at the business card he'd set down at some point during the morning, and which now lay face up in the flat bar of window light, with the 3 words visible. "We should talk." He picked it up, turned it over, put it in his jacket pocket. "Grimm," he said. Grimm looked at him. "The men who came into her room," Ridge said, "the men Rode ran into at the annex, if they come back, they won't find what they're looking for," Grimm said. "That's not what I'm asking." Grimm met his eyes. "I know it's not," Grimm said. "Go." Ridge went. He drove south on the interstate with Marker's truck, which smelled of machine oil and had a crack in the passenger window that let in a thin stream of cold air all the way from Black Hollow to Billings. And the cold on his face was the only external thing he was aware of, because every other part of his attention was on the shape of what was coming. He had no guarantee that Vivian Mercer would see him. He had no guarantee that seeing him would matter. He had no guarantee that the woman who co-signed a wire transfer 18 months ago was not going to pick up her phone the moment he appeared in her lobby and call the man who had just threatened his daughter. He had 1 hour and 20 minutes of interstate to prepare for a conversation that would determine whether 900 people recovered anything from 30 years of work, whether a government official who had built a legal exit from a 7-year theft walked away free, and whether a 7-year-old girl with a stuffed dog missing one eye made it home from school in a world that was not actively hunting her. The highway was straight and flat, and the sky above it was the color of concrete, and the truck held the road without drama, and Ridge Callahan drove south through the Montana winter with his hands steady on the wheel and the cold at the window, and the full weight of everything he had built, and everything he stood to lose sitting in the seat beside him, like a passenger that did not need to be spoken to because it had been there the entire time. From the first number in the first notebook in the first night at Ruth's Pen Kitchen, when he should have closed the laptop and driven away, and instead he found her in a conference room on the 14th floor, not by appointment, not through her assistant who had told him twice in the lobby that Ms. Mercer was unavailable, and would he like to leave a card? He'd said no. He'd sat in the lobby for 11 minutes watching the elevator bank until he saw the pattern, the 14th floor button lighting up on 3 consecutive internal calls. And then he'd badged through the security turnstile on a maintenance worker's blind side and taken the stairs. He came through the stairwell door onto 14 and nearly walked into a woman carrying 2 folders and a tablet, who stepped back and looked at him with the particular alarm of someone encountering a man who looks exactly the way Ridge looked at that moment. Unshaven, 3-day coat, eyes that had not closed in 30 hours. "Vivian Mercer," he said. "Conference room." She pointed left. Pure reflex, probably. He was already moving. He pushed the door open. Vivian Mercer was 52, silver-haired, with the composed bearing of a woman who had spent 20 years in rooms full of men who underestimated her and had long since stopped registering it as an inconvenience. She was alone, laptop open, coffee going cold at her elbow. She looked up when he entered, and her expression moved through 3 distinct phases in approximately 1 second: surprise, assessment, decision. And then she said, very calmly, "Close the door." He closed it. She looked at him. "You're the records clerk from Black Hollow." He didn't ask how she knew. "Callahan," he said. "Ridge Callahan." "Sit down," she said. He sat. She studied him across the table the way you study something you've been expecting and are relieved to finally see in front of you rather than operating somewhere you can't observe it. "How much do you have?" $52 million, he said. 8 vendors, full approval chains, 8 years of transfers. Graham Voss's name on every authorization above threshold. He paused. "And Crestmark Capital Partners." Something shifted in her face. "Marcus Halden," Ridge said. The shift completed. What replaced it was not guilt, not fear. It was the specific, exhausted recognition of a woman who has been sitting with knowledge she didn't know how to use and has just watched someone else walk in carrying the same weight. "How long have you known?" he said. She was quiet for 4 seconds. 7 months, she said. The conference room was silent. 14 floors below them, Billings moved through its ordinary Tuesday morning. "And the wire transfer," Ridge said. "The legal retainer to Aldous and Crane in Phoenix. You co-signed it." "Graham told me it was standard regulatory coverage for the pension fund audit cycle." Her voice was level, but the levelness had cost her something. "I signed it. 6 weeks later, I found an internal memo that made me go back and look at what I'd actually signed, and by then..." She stopped. "By then, Sandra Keller was already gone," Ridge said. She looked at him. "You know about Sandra. She's been building her own case for 14 months, he said. "She's in Black Hollow right now with everything she has, and everything I have, organized for simultaneous transmission to multiple federal recipients." He paused. "She also found the emergency disbursement amendment on the pension fund management agreement." Vivian Mercer closed her eyes for precisely 3 seconds. When she opened them, the composure was still there, but it had rearranged itself around something harder. "He built it so the investigation triggers the disbursement." "Yes." "Which means the moment anyone files a referral, he moves the remaining $22 million before a freeze order can be processed," Ridge said, "unless someone coordinates a pre-referral asset freeze through the right channel with the right authority before the investigation is formally logged." She looked at him. "You need me to make a call." "I need you to make a call." "To whom?" "You tell me," he said. 7 months. Who have you been sitting on this with?" She looked at the table for a moment. Then she picked up her phone. His own phone rang before she finished dialing. "Grim." He answered. "Lucy's out," Grim said. "She's with Sergeant at a location they don't know. She's okay." A pause, compressed and taut. "But we have a problem at the shop." Ridge stood. What problem? 3 vehicles, hauled in security firm. They came for the files. Grimm's voice had the flat quality of a man operating in a situation and reporting on it simultaneously. We expected one. We got 3. Are you? We're holding, Grimm said. But Ridge, they're not trying to take the files anymore. They're trying to make sure the files can't leave. Ridge understood what that meant. How long can you hold? Long enough, but you need to make whatever call you're making right now. He looked at Vivian Mercer. She was already talking. Low voice, rapid, the specific cadence of a woman who has rehearsed this conversation in her head for 7 months, and is now running it in real time with the particular controlled urgency of someone who knows exactly how much time they don't have. Ridge walked to the window. Billings spread below him, flat and cold and ordinary. A city that had no idea what was happening inside one of its buildings. He thought about Black Hollow, 40 miles north. He thought about a machine shop with a cold wood stove and 3 vehicles in the lot that had come to make sure nothing left. He thought about Grimm, about Road with a cracked rib, about Marker's steadiness and Sergeant's cane and the Vietnam-era tattoo on a forearm that had been doing this kind of work in one form or another for 50 years. He thought about what it cost people to decide. Mercer finished the call. She set the phone on the table and looked at him. 40 minutes, she said. FBI Financial Crimes, Field Supervisor. She's coordinating with the Federal Pension Oversight Office for an emergency administrative freeze. Pre-referral. She paused. But she needs the documentation transmitted in the next 20 minutes for the timing to work before Halden can trigger the disbursement clause. 20 minutes. Sandra, Ridge said, already moving. He called her running for the stairs. She answered on half a ring. Transmit now, he said. Everything. All recipients simultaneously. Don't wait. I need the secondary confirmation code from your notebook. The routing verification I flagged on page. 41, he said. The number at the bottom margin, circled in red. The sound of paper. Got it, she said. Go. He heard keys. He was in the stairwell, taking flights 2 at a time. The sound of his boots on the concrete echoing up and down the shaft in a rhythm that matched nothing except the specific urgency of a man who has exactly 20 minutes and 12 flights of stairs. His phone buzzed. Grimm. Text. They're at the door. Then a second text 10 seconds later. We're not moving. Ridge hit the lobby at a run, crossed it without slowing, pushed through the glass doors into the Billings cold and the flat winter light and the sound of traffic on the street. And he stood on the sidewalk with his phone in his hand and Sandra's keyboard still audible through the line, and Grimm's 2 texts on the screen and the clock in his chest counting down the 20 minutes that would determine whether 900 people lost everything or whether the machine that had been running for 8 years finally hit a wall. It could not move through. His phone rang again. Unknown number, he answered. Mr. Callahan? Dalt's voice, smooth, neutral, doing a job. You've made this significantly more complicated than it needed to be. I know, Ridge said. It's been too late, Ridge said, since the night you went into my daughter's room. A pause. That wasn't my decision, Dalt said. I know whose decision it was, Ridge said, and he's going to have a very specific kind of morning in about 18 minutes. The line went quiet for 3 full seconds. What have you done? Dalt said. Not a question. The voice of a man doing rapid internal calculation and arriving at a number he did not want. Ridge said nothing. He looked up at the building. 14th floor. The window where Vivian Mercer was still standing at the table, phone in hand, doing the thing she had been sitting on for 7 months with nowhere to put it. Tell Halden he built a good machine, Ridge said. He just forgot that machines built on other people's suffering need someone to keep them quiet. And eventually, he paused. You run out of people willing to stay quiet. He ended the call. He stood in the cold. 17 minutes. His phone buzzed. Sandra. Transmitting. He looked at the screen. The word sat there in the plain font of a text message. 1 word. Present tense. It was happening. Right now, 40 miles north in a machine shop with 3 vehicles in the lot and Grimm and Marker and Road with his cracked rib and his jaw set, holding the line between the documentation and the men who had come to make sure it never left, the files were moving. through Sandra's laptop, through the transmission pathways she'd spent 4 hours building, to multiple recipients simultaneously, so that no single interception point could stop all of it, so that the documents became unfixable the moment they left, because they were already everywhere. His phone buzzed again. Grim. Vehicles pulling back. Ridge stared at this. A second message. All three. Moving out. He read it twice. He thought about why. He thought about Dalt on the phone doing rapid calculation and arriving at a number and what that number meant to the men Marcus Halden had positioned outside a machine shop in Black Hollow, Montana, to prevent documents from leaving. If the documents were already transmitting, if the calculation had shifted from prevent to too late, then the men in those 3 vehicles had just received new instructions. Don't hold the line. Preserve deniability. Disappear. Ridge looked at the building in front of him. He thought about Marcus Halden, wherever he was right now, receiving the same calculation. A government official with a legal exit clause and a retirement fund and 17 minutes of window that was closing with every second that passed. A man who had spent 7 years building something and 6 months watching it develop cracks. And 14 months since a woman named Sandra Keller first wrote a memo that he'd managed to bury. And who was now sitting with the understanding that the burial had not held. He thought about what a man like that does in the 17 minutes he has left. He thought about deniability. He thought about emergency disbursement clauses. He called Sandra. "Are you transmitting the fund management amendment?" he said. "The Halden signature on the emergency disbursement provision?" "It's in the package," she said. "It's going. Make sure the FBI field supervisor has it specifically flagged," he said. "She needs to freeze the fund before Halden triggers the disbursement. If he moves first—" "I flagged it," Sandra said. "Ridge." A pause. "It's going. It's all going, just—" Her voice shifted slightly. The controlled forensic precision of the past hours briefly revealing the human being underneath it. "Just let it go." He stood on the sidewalk. He breathed. The cold was absolute. The sky was concrete. A truck went past on the street and a woman walked by with a coffee, and the city moved around him with the complete indifference of a world that did not know what was happening inside the transmission that was moving through Sandra's laptop 40 miles north. 15 minutes. His phone buzzed. Grim. Shop is clear. Everyone standing. Then 10 seconds later, a second message. Not words. A photograph. Low resolution. Taken quickly. Slightly blurred at the edges. The interior of the machine shop. The long wooden table. Grim and Marker and Rode. Rode sitting, favoring his left side. Jaw tight with the effort of looking like it didn't hurt. And at the far end of the table, Sargent with his cane hooked on the chair arm and his forearm flat on the table and the Vietnam-era tattoo visible in the garage light. And at the edge of the frame, barely in it, a small shape in a too large borrowed jacket, dark hair visible under a knit cap pushed back from her face, sitting in a chair that was too big for her with a stuffed dog under one arm and an expression of absolute unimpressed calm. Lucy, 7 years old, surrounded by bikers in a machine shop in Montana, completely unharmed, watching whatever was happening with the frank scientific interest of a child who has decided this is the most interesting Thursday she has ever had. Ridge looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked at it until the tight thing in his chest loosened enough that he could breathe around it. Then he looked up at the building and thought about everything moving through Sandra's laptop and the FBI field supervisor coordinating a pre-referral freeze and Vivian Mercer on the 14th floor making the call she'd been unable to make for 7 months. And he thought about how close it had all come. How many times in the past 12 hours the weight had been 1 degree from tipping in the wrong direction. 12 minutes. He started walking. Not away, not to his car, back into the building. Because whatever happened in the next 12 minutes, whether the freeze order cleared in time, whether Halden moved before it landed, whether the documents reached the right hands before the wrong ones could respond, there was one more thing Ridge Callahan needed to do in that building, on that floor, in that conference room. He needed to be in the room when it happened. He needed to see it. Not for himself. He had stopped needing things for himself a long time ago. Somewhere on a hospital corridor in Fort Lewis on the worst night of his life. For Frances Aldrich. For Sandra Keller and her 14 months and her 3 boxes of files and the specific loneliness of a person who found something true and watched it get buried and kept watching anyway. For every name on that pension fund roster who had contributed 30 years of work to a system they trusted, and never knew how badly it had been designed to fail them. He pushed through the glass doors. He crossed the lobby. He hit the elevator button. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he did not look at it because whatever it said, and there was nothing left to adjust or redirect or manage. The documentation was moving. The call had been made. The freeze was either going to land in time or it wasn't, and the only thing left for Ridge Callahan to do was stand in the room where it happened and be a witness. The elevator doors opened. He stepped in. The doors closed. The car moved upward through 14 floors of silence, and his own reflection looked back at him from the polished metal of the doors, unshaven, exhausted, coat smelling of Montana winter and machine oil and 3 days of running. And he looked at that reflection and did not look away from it, because he had learned a long time ago that the only thing worse than seeing yourself clearly was the elevator doors opened on 14. Ridge walked back into the conference room, and Vivian Mercer was standing at the window with her phone in her hand and the expression of a woman who has just put down something she has been carrying alone for 7 months and does not yet know how to feel about her own hands without it. She turned when he came in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "The freeze order," Ridge said. "Submitted," she said. 8 minutes ago. The field supervisor is coordinating with the Federal Pension Oversight Office." She paused. "It depends on timing." "I know. If Halden moves before the administrative hold clears—" "I know," Ridge said again. He walked to the table and sat down, not because he was calm, but because his legs had been carrying him for 30 hours, and the conference room chair was the first horizontal surface he'd encountered that wasn't moving. He put his phone on the table. He looked at it. 3 minutes passed in silence. His phone lit up. "Sandra." He answered. "The freeze cleared," she said. 2 minutes ago. The fund is locked." A pause. "Ridge, the fund is locked." He sat with that. "Halden?" he said. "The FBI field supervisor just confirmed an emergency hold on all Crestmark-affiliated accounts pending investigation. She said—" Sandra's voice shifted slightly, the way it had on the sidewalk call, the forensic precision briefly giving way to something underneath. "She said the timing was under 4 minutes of margin." 4 minutes. He looked at the window. "Sandra," he said. "Yeah." "You okay?" A long pause, the kind that has years in it. "Ask me in a week," she said. "Okay," he said. "Ask me then too." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. He ended the call. Vivian Mercer was watching him from across the room. She had the look of a person reassessing a situation they thought they understood. "She found it first," she said, 14 months ago. "Yes. And I signed the document that got her terminated." "You signed a wire transfer you were told was a legal retainer," Ridge said. "That's different." "Is it?" He looked at her steadily. "That's for you to decide, not me." She looked at the window. "Graham Voss has been managing my signature for 3 years, she said. It came out flat, the flatness of someone making a factual inventory rather than seeking absolution. I trusted the reporting structure because I came in as a change agent and I needed internal buy-in, and he was the most credible voice in the room." She paused. "That's not an excuse." "No," Ridge said. "It's not." He picked up his phone. "But it's a starting point." Pam. He drove back to Black Hollow in Marker's truck, with the cracked window and the cold air at his neck, and the flat January highway running north under a sky that had cleared finally to something approaching actual blue. The kind of blue that only appears in Montana in winter after a week of concrete gray. Absolute, almost aggressive, the sky announcing itself after a long silence. He drove without the radio. He drove with the window cracked enough to feel the air. He drove the way a man drives when the weight is shifted but not lifted, when the thing he has been carrying has not disappeared but has changed shape into something he can recognize rather than something that operated in the dark. He thought about Graham Voss. He would be arrested before the end of the day. Sandra's transmission had gone to the FBI, the SEC Fraud Division, and the state AG's office simultaneously. The documentation was thorough enough that the case would take 18 months to fully prosecute, but the arrest would be today. Ridge knew this the way he knew things he'd observed without being told. the FBI field supervisor's voice when she confirmed the freeze had the cadence of someone already moving. He thought about Marcus Halden, a government official whose exit clause had been locked before he could trigger it, whose beneficial ownership of the company that had sold software to the fund he'd been overseeing was now in the possession of 3 federal bodies, whose name was on the emergency disbursement provision of a document that had been designed as a final act of theft and would now function as the clearest possible evidence of premeditation. The kind of case that did not resolve quietly. He thought about Sandra Keller, who had written a memo 14 months ago and been removed from the board and spent 14 months watching from outside with 3 boxes of files, learning law on her own and building a parallel case alone in a Billings apartment above a dry cleaner, who had been right from the beginning and had been made to wait 14 months for anyone else to be standing in the same room with the same picture. He thought about what that cost. He thought about what it cost to be right and invisible at the same time. The machine shop was warm when he got back. Someone had restarted the wood stove and it was going hard, the heat reaching all the way to the door when he pushed it open. The long table had coffee on it, actual coffee, not vending machine, which meant Ruth had sent something over, which meant the town's information network had communicated that this was a morning requiring proper coffee. Grimm was at the table. Rode was beside him, one arm held slightly away from his body, in the careful manner of a man with a cracked rib who has decided not to acknowledge it while anyone is watching. Marker was near the stove. Sargent in his chair. Sandra at the far end with her laptop closed for the first time all morning, both hands around a mug, looking at the table with the expression of someone who has just set down a weight and is still feeling the shape of it in her palms. Lucy was sitting on the workbench against the wall. She had someone's leather vest draped over her shoulders. Markers, by the size of it, enormous on her, the patches hanging past her elbows. And she was eating something from a wrapper that Ruth had sent and reading a children's paperback with the complete self-possessed calm of a child who has processed the morning's events and filed them under interesting rather than frightening, which said something about her that Ridge had known for 7 years and still found quietly astonishing. She looked up when he came in. She looked at him the way she looked at him every morning when he came back from his late nights. That brief total inventory, checking that the configuration was unchanged. He crossed the room. He sat on the workbench beside her. She leaned against him without setting down the book. He put his arm around her. The machine shop was warm and the coffee smelled right, and outside the blue sky was doing its aggressive January thing, and nobody in the room said anything for a while because there was a specific kind of silence that follows the thing you have been bracing against, when the bracing is over and the body doesn't quite know yet what to do with the absence of tension. It was Sargent who spoke first, from his chair by the stove. "Done?" he said. "Done," Ridge said. Sargent nodded once. He looked at the wall. He took a slow drink of coffee and said nothing else, which was his way of communicating that the subject was complete and the next order of business was rest, and Sargent's assessments of what the next order of business should be had a quality of authority that nobody in the room questioned. Grimm looked at Ridge across the table. "Sandra stays in Black Hollow," Grimm said. It was not a question. Ridge looked at Sandra. She looked at her mug. "I don't have anywhere pressing to be," she said. "Ruth's got a second back room," Ridge said. "I know," Sandra said. "She already offered." Ridge looked at Grimm. Grimm picked up his coffee. That was the conversation. It was Rode who said the thing nobody else had said. Later, 2 hours later, when the adrenaline had fully metabolized into exhaustion and people had started moving slowly and speaking less, Rode came and sat at the end of the workbench, the careful one-armed movement he was using now, and looked at Ridge with the direct, unhurried quality of a man who has decided to say something and is going to say it simply. 3 years, Rode said. Ridge looked at him. "You've been doing this alone for 3 years, Rode said. The daughter, the road, all of it." Ridge didn't answer. "That's a long time," Rode said. "Yes," Ridge said. Rode nodded. He looked at his coffee. "It doesn't have to keep being that long," he said. He said it the way Grimm said things. Not as philosophy, not as comfort, but as information. As a simple factual update on the state of available options. Ridge looked at him. Rode got up and moved back toward the stove with his cracked rib and his coffee, and his characteristic lack of interest in whether his statement was acknowledged, because he had said what he had to say, and the saying of it was enough. Lucy turned a page in her book. Ridge looked at the machine shop, the long table, the mismatched chairs, the photographs on the wall, the wood stove working in the corner, the men sitting in the warmth they'd built over 11 years in a town that had needed something like them without knowing what to call it. He thought about Elena. He thought about her saying that financial fraud was the purest kind of cowardice. He thought about what she would have made of this room, of these men, of the fact that a records clerk and a disgraced auditor and a brotherhood of veterans who fixed motorcycles and drank bad coffee and walked 4 blocks in sub-zero temperatures because they decided a child deserved someone on the corner, that this collection of improbable, damaged, completely unnecessary people had managed to do what proper channels had failed to do for 8 years. He thought she would have been unsurprised. She had always understood that institutions are structures, and structures are made by people, and people fail, and that the things which actually hold are the things that are chosen rather than assigned, loyalty chosen, presence chosen. The decision to sit across from a stranger in a diner at 2 a.m. and say, "I thought you should know." He thought she would have liked Grimm. He thought she might have told him so in the flat, honest way she had, and that Grimm would have received it with the same unremarkable calm he received everything, because Grimm was a man for whom being accurately seen was not a novelty, but a baseline expectation. Ridge looked at Lucy. She had finished the book. She was looking at the wall of photographs. Men on motorcycles, group shots in front of the machine shop at different points over 11 years, the specific visual record of a group of people who had been somewhere long enough to accumulate evidence of their own continuity. "Who are all these people?" she said. Grimm, at the table, looked up. "Some of them are us," he said. "Some of them passed through." "Passed through how?" she said. "Different ways," Grimm said. Lucy looked at the photographs for another moment. "Are we going to be on the wall?" Grimm looked at Ridge. Ridge looked at his daughter. "I don't know," he said honestly. Lucy considered this with the serious evaluative attention she gave to questions that actually interested her. Then she turned back to the photographs and found the oldest one, faded, corner-curled, men younger than anyone at the table now, standing in front of the machine shop when it still had its original sign, squinting into a summer sun that had since been replaced by 22 Montana winters. "I think we should be," she said. Factual. Settled. The room was quiet. Then Rode from near the stove made a sound that was genuinely a laugh. Short, surprised out of him. The specific involuntary sound of a man who has been holding himself together with some effort and has just found the edge of something human enough to laugh at. Marker smiled at the floor. Sargent looked at the photographs on the wall and said nothing, but the quality of his silence had changed. Grimm looked at Ridge. Ridge looked back at him. No words necessary. The wood stove popped. The blue sky held. Outside, down the block, a single Harley turned over. Not leaving, just running, idling in the cold with the low, patient rumble of an engine that has been maintained by someone who knows it well, the sound of something that has been through enough to know the difference between stopping and resting. It idled for a moment. Then it eased. And the machine shop in Black Hollow, Montana settled into the specific quiet of a place that has held the weight it needed to hold and is now simply warm and present and full of the kind of people who do not require the world to thank them for what they did, because they did not do it for the world. They did it because it was in front of them, because someone needed it, because that was the only reason that had ever been enough. Ridge Callahan sat on a workbench with his arm around his daughter and coffee going cold in his hand and looked at the wall of photographs and understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has survived something he was not sure he would survive, that this was what it looked like when the thing you almost lost became the thing you kept. Not without cost, not without damage, but kept. Lucy put her head against his arm. Outside, the Harley was quiet now. Inside, the coffee was still hot.